The Book of Amos, a call to justice, judgment, and the promise of restoration. The Book of Amos is a stern warning wrapped in vivid imagery and righteous indignation. A prophet from the southern kingdom of Judah, Amos is sent to the prosperous yet morally corrupt northern kingdom of Israel to deliver a message that rings with urgency, rebuke, and a call for repentance. As the shepherd prophet confronts Israel's sins, he warns of a judgment that will not be withheld. Yet in the midst of Amos's oracles of doom, there shines a vision of future restoration and the glory of David's kingdom. His message, echoing through the ages, speaks to every generation about justice, righteousness, and the heart of God. Let's consider the background and setting of Amos. Amos lived during the reigns of Uzziah in Judah and Jeroboam II in Israel. This was a time of unprecedented prosperity for Israel, but it was prosperity built on injustice, idolatry, and moral decay. The nation was affluent, but it had grown brazen in its sins, exhibiting a shocking lack of concern for the poor and a disregard for God's standards. It had been around 200 years since the northern kingdom had established itself with calf worship as its official religion. Despite past prophets like Elijah, Elisha, and Jonah, Israel remained hardened in sin, racing towards inevitable judgment. Tekoa, Amos's hometown, lay 10 miles south of Jerusalem and overlooked the wilderness of Judea. He was neither a priest nor a professional prophet, but a simple shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees. As he traveled north to Bethel, one of Israel's major centers of idol worship, Amos boldly proclaimed God's message of repentance, knowing full well that it would not be well received. Amos's prophecy begins with a series of judgments against Israel's neighbors: Syria, Philistia, Phoenicia, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah, and finally Israel itself. Using the repeated phrase, "for 3 transgressions," and "for 4," Amos lists the sins of each nation, revealing the justice of God. While Israel's enemies were indeed guilty of grievous sins, God's fiercest rebukes are reserved for his own people, Israel, who had a unique covenant relationship with him. "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." Israel's privilege came with responsibility, and they were held accountable for their persistent rebellion. Now let's examine the woes of Israel's false security and indulgence. Amos's prophecies cut to the heart of Israel's complacency and self-assurance. He addresses the opulence of Samaria, the capital, and rebukes its inhabitants for building luxurious palaces at the expense of the poor. In a biting description, he calls the women of Samaria cows of Bashan, symbolizing their excessive indulgence and indifference toward the suffering of others. These wealthy citizens felt secure, but Amos warns them of an impending judgment that will tear down their security. The prophet condemns Israel's hypocritical religious practices, noting how they continued to worship at Bethel and Gilgal with a hollow piety. Israel's sacrifices and songs were noise to God because they lacked true justice and righteousness. God's call was clear: seek good and not evil, that you may live. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. Without genuine repentance, their worship was meaningless, an offense rather than a delight to God. Israel believed they were safe from God's judgment because of their covenant status. Yet Amos warns of the day of the Lord, not as a day of salvation, but as a day of darkness and terror for the unrepentant. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. It is darkness and not light. Amos 5:18. Through striking images, Amos describes this day as a time of inescapable judgment, where even fleeing from danger will lead straight into more peril, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him. Amos 5:19. Amos shares a series of visions that symbolize the complete destruction awaiting Israel. In the vision of locusts and the vision of fire, God reveals impending judgment. Twice, Amos intercedes on behalf of Israel, and God relents. However, in the third vision, the plumb line, God declares that Israel has been weighed, measured, and found wanting. "I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword," God declares. By the time of the fourth vision, a basket of ripe summer fruit, the message is that Israel's iniquity is ripe for punishment, and their end is near. One of the most haunting prophecies of Amos is his prediction of a famine, not of bread or water, but of hearing the word of the Lord. In this coming time of judgment, the people would run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but shall not find it. This tragic silence signifies God's withdrawal from a nation that repeatedly rejected his voice. It is a warning that there is a limit to God's patience, and that those who continually ignore him may one day find themselves without his guidance. God's justice and accountability. Amos reminds us that privilege brings responsibility. Israel's unique relationship with God did not exempt them from judgment. Instead, it increased their accountability. Likewise, as believers, we are called to live lives that reflect God's holiness. We must not presume upon God's grace while living in persistent sin. God is just, and he will not overlook rebellion indefinitely, the danger of empty worship. The Israelites were still very religious, but their worship was superficial, devoid of justice or compassion. Amos's message challenges us to examine our own worship. Are our songs and sacrifices genuine expressions of love and reverence for God, or are they merely rituals? True worship flows from a heart that values justice, mercy, and humility before God, a call to repentance and seeking good. Amos urges the people to seek the Lord and live. This is an invitation and a warning. Repentance is not merely feeling sorry, it involves a transformation of life and values. We are called to seek good and hate evil actively. This means standing up for righteousness and refusing to turn a blind eye to injustice, the reality of God's judgment. Amos's warnings about the day of the Lord remind us of the reality of God's judgment. It is easy to think that God's judgment only applies to other people, but Amos challenges us to examine our own lives. God is holy, and there will be a reckoning for unrepentant sin. This should prompt us to live in a way that reflects our awareness of God's righteous standards, the hope of restoration. Despite the grim prophecies, Amos ends with a message of hope. God promises to restore the fallen house of David and to extend his kingdom not only over Israel, but over all nations. In that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen and repair its breaches. Amos foresaw a time when God's people would be restored and blessed, a prophecy that ultimately points to the coming of Christ and the establishment of his church, open to all who believe. The Book of Amos begins with thunderous warnings and ends with a glimmer of hope. The lion's roar, a call to repentance, echoes through the centuries, challenging each generation to consider the consequences of injustice, hypocrisy, and disregard for God's commands. Amos speaks to a world much like ours, prosperous yet often indifferent to suffering, religious but at times disconnected from true worship. In Amos's words, we find a God who is both just and merciful, holy yet loving. He calls his people to a life that mirrors his character, a life of justice, compassion, and humility. And though judgment is real, so is the promise of restoration for those who turn back to him. Amos's final vision of hope reminds us that God's love endures, and that his ultimate desire is not destruction, but restoration. Through repentance and a genuine commitment to his ways, we too can experience the joy of knowing and walking with our God.